NBC contributor Jonathan Capehart, Isaac Chotiner with The New Republic, columnist and activist Sally Cohn, and McKay Coppins with BuzzFeed.com. So, Isaac, let's pick up what happened this week, because I want to first sort of define for people what the fault lines are here in this sort of the centrists versus the progressives, or the populists within the Democratic Party, this third way versus Elizabeth Warren. In the op-ed that sort of kicked this off, Third Way is talking about specifically this plan that Elizabeth Warren's put out there and a couple other progressives on the idea of expanding Social Security. Let's stop this debate over whether it should be cut and how much it should be cut. They're saying let's expand it. So that's one issue that that Third Way is putting out there. It seems there's Medicare is also a part of this, regulating the big banks. What are the fault lines right now that are sort of dividing the Democratic Party?
Well, you mentioned Social Security and Medicare, which are two of the big ones, but I think really this is about Wall Street. And you played clips of Elizabeth Warren and Obama sounding rhetorically somewhat similar in their approach to how the American economy works and how capitalism should work best and so on. But there are actually real fault lines between, say, Warren and Obama. And I think you saw glimmers of what we're going to see going forward for the Democratic Party in the fight between Janet Yellen and Larry Summers about who's going to be the next chair of the Fed. And, you know, substantively, they're pretty close, but more Wall Street-friendly Democrats and people in the White House were clearly supportive of Summers. And as for Warren, she has, as for Yellen, she has much more support among the grassroots, and that ultimately she got the nomination. But I think those are the real issues, the Wall Street issues, how to regulate the banks, rather than Social Security and Medicare, which are going to be the fault lines for the Democrats.
When we say regulating the banks, when we say there's a divide there between Obama and sort of the centrist, what Obama's done, what Dodd-Frank kind of represents, and what Warren and Janet Yellen, those types are pushing for, what specifically, what are we talking policy-wise?
Well, let's be clear about, before we even get there, let's talk about sort of where that divide exists, because the divide doesn't exist with the American people. This is the really fundamental thing that the Third Way op-ed totally missed the boat on, is the American people support a more economic populist move in politics. And incidentally, a lot of Republican voters do as well.
The banks are not popular.
They want, well, it's broader than that. So yes, they think the majority of voters, including in swing districts and a strong number of independents, believe the president, for instance, hasn't done enough to deal with the housing crisis and to hold banks accountable, including for their criminal acts. That's one example. But it goes beyond that. A majority of voters think we should raise taxes on the wealthy to increase investments that will support the middle class and spur job creation. That's also part of this economic populism that Third Way didn't take on directly, but is really what they're about. They're just sort of about
what Elizabeth Warren is getting at there, and one of the sort of sub-debates that emerged this week is she sent this letter out challenging sort of the 6 big banks, disclose all of your, you know, who are you funding think tank-wise, and then now they haven't done that. But the leaders of Third Way, I think it was Jonathan Chait with New York Magazine, they said less than 1% of our funding comes from Wall Street financial institutions. But they were calling for disclosure, but what they also left open was the possibility that a lot of their money comes from people who make their money on Wall Street. Right. So it's not directly coming, but it is still, in a way, Wall Street money.
Well, what strikes me as interesting about the internal Democrat versus the internal Republican debate, at least in Washington, is that the debate on the left seems much more substantive, right? There are genuine disagreements over policy that are taking place and shaping this debate. On the right, the Republican Civil War that we talk about, in Washington at least, is more about tactics and strategy and how aggressive to be. The shutdown, for example, the government shutdown, there was a lot of disagreement in Washington about that, but that wasn't a policy. That was all about how much hardball to play, right? And so Republicans disagree about that. Now, when you expand the Republican debate to governors and to people across the country, there are substantive differences. But in Washington, on the left, there's a real policy divide that's taking place, and that's going to be important.
So when we talk about this split, Jonathan, can we illustrate it? Are there numbers, are there names we can put on it? How is the party divided? How is the Democratic Party divided right now when it comes to these questions of economic populism?
Well, I mean, I think we're seeing it right now. I mean, all this talk about whether Senator Warren is going to run against former Secretary Clinton, I mean, that's where you see the dividing line. But I think McKay brings up a very good point, and that is, and I'm glad you said it because I was just about to jump in, that there is a policy difference here, battle that's happening within the Democratic Party. And Third Way, as a matter of full disclosure, I talk to folks at Third Way all the time. I mean, they are yes, they're centrist, they're clear-eyed, but they're looking at it looking at issues not as rah-rah Democrats. They're looking at issues for what's good for the country from a centrist, center-left point of view. Now, that's not going to go over very well, as Sally gives me the side eyes. It's not going to go over well with you, but there's a legitimate debate to be had about what to do about Social Security. Just because Social Security is fine now doesn't mean that it's going to be fine in 2031, and something needs. Folks at Third Way are looking at this as 2031 is going to get here whether we like it or not, and so let's get things in place to, as they would say, save Social Security, save Medicaid, Medicare, so that's
what's interesting. That's what's interesting to me. If we want to talk about Social Security, what's interesting to me about this moment is the debate about Social Security. As long as I've been alive and as long as I've been hearing this, has been framed in those terms: save Social Security, solvency of Social Security. In 1983, we always had these dates, and there's an attempt right now that I'm seeing, at least by Elizabeth Warren and others on the left, to just change the terms of the debates and to blow it up. So it's not about Social Security's future is always on the line. There are steps we can take that could actually make this a much bigger program with, raising the cap on the payroll tax, something like that. I haven't seen anybody pushing for that debate to take place in the Democratic Party. Now I'm seeing that for the first time.
And it's incredibly refreshing. And look, I don't want to argue with Jonathan as though he's the proxy for Third Way. I know,
Can you disclose your income?
But I will say this much. What's fascinating to McKay's point as well about the Republican Party is, they have this, they keep losing, right? I mean, we've talked about the voter suppression, all of that. The reason that they're trying to suppress votes is because they know that their demographic is getting older and effectively, going to that great polling box in the sky. And, we have the country with us. We are winning larger and larger majorities on the left. And yet, Republicans remain very steadfast about these incredibly unpopular views, whether it's social issues or economic issues. And then here you have Democrats
I feel like
who
I'm
win.
caught in the crossfire.
The point is the Democrats win. We won, and we still won't even say, hey, let's actually preserve the social safety net that made this country great. We're going to try and
But you know what? Democrats are winning outside of Washington. Senator Warren is the only one of Senator Warren on Capitol Hill. When you look on the right, the Tea Party, you can look, since 2010, there are a lot of Tea Party people on Capitol Hill. So unless and until Senator Warren has reinforcements of new people coming to Washington, and some of these folks who are now speaking out against Third Way, if they then back up their criticisms of Third Way by standing directly behind Senator Warren and giving her some backup, then I think what you're talking about.
That is a perfect. We will pick this right up after the break, because there was some on the left are saying they sensed a change, a pivot in a way, and from the president this week, closer to the Warren camp with some of the things that he said in his speech this week. So we're going to play clips from that. We're going to talk about that. And also the idea of maybe the equivalent grassroots movement towards the Tea Party cropping up on the left that's going to try to go after more aggressively the Third Way types. There was some news about that this week. Long tease there, but that's what we're talking about in the next.